The men who built Rhodesia did not think of themselves as the architects of a racial state. They thought of themselves as Britons. That distinction, which may seem like semantic vanity to a 21st century reader, was the load-bearing pillar of the entire Rhodesian political project, and the key to understanding why the country that Ian Smith ran from Salisbury and the country that Hendrik Verwoerd ran from Pretoria, though neighbours in geography and in racial outcome, was separated by a genuine and fiercely defended ideological chasm. When Cecil Rhodes pushed his British South Africa Company north of the Limpopo River in 1890, he carried with him the political grammar of the Victorian Cape Colony. That grammar was enshrined in a phrase he would repeat throughout his career: equal rights for all civilized men. The franchise of the Cape Colony, whatever its practical limitations, was formally non-racial. A black African man who met the property and income thresholds, who owned a house, who earned enough, who could sign his name, could vote. In theory, at least, civilization rather than skin color was the gateway to political belonging. Following Cecil Rhodes's dictum, there was an implicit, albeit not overt, racial component to the franchise, which effectively excluded a majority of native black people from the electorate via such means as property qualifications. The crucial word is implicit. Race was the outcome, not the stated principle. And that distinction, between a system that excluded by race and a system that excluded on ostensibly race-neutral grounds whose practical effect was racial, would define the specific character of Rhodesian ideology for the better part of a century. South Africa moved in the opposite direction at almost every juncture. In the Cape Colony, the Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892 raised the property franchise qualification and added an educational element, disenfranchising a disproportionate number of non-white voters. Then, at Union in 1910, the qualified black vote of the Cape was ring-fenced and left to atrophy rather than extended to the new country's other provinces. Africans lost any franchise on a common voters' roll in 1936, at the height of the segregationist era, and people classified as coloured finally lost such a vote in 1956, during the early years of apartheid. Each step stripped away the liberal Cape inheritance. The Afrikaner National Party, which came to power in 1948 under D.F. Malan and was then theorized into an ideological system by Verwoerd, completed the project. Apartheid was not merely segregation. It was a philosophically totalizing program in which racial classification underpinned every interaction between citizen and state. HNP leaders argued that South Africa did not comprise a single nation but was made up of 4 distinct racial groups: white, black, colored, and Indian, split into 13 nations or racial federations. The pass laws, the Group Areas Act, the Separate Amenities Act, these were the bureaucratic machinery of that vision. Apartheid's ambition, in its Verwoerdian formulation, was the permanent partitioning of humanity itself. Rhodesia was doing something different, or so its ruling class insisted, and the insistence was not purely cynical. When the settler colony received self-government from Britain in 1923, it carried forward a franchise tradition rooted in the Cape model: qualified, property-based, theoretically non-racial, and, in practice, overwhelmingly white. The men who ran southern Rhodesia in the 1940s and 1950s did not want to be compared to the National Party across the Limpopo. They regarded Afrikanerdum's racial theology with a mixture of condescension and unease. They were British. They had fought under the RAF in the Second World War. Ian Smith himself was shot down twice as a fighter pilot. They drank scotch, played cricket, and sent their children to schools modelled on English grammar schools. The emotional and cultural axis of their identity ran north to London, not south to Pretoria. This was the context for what became, during the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in the 1950s, a genuine experiment in what its architects called multiracialism. Under Prime Minister Garfield Todd, a New Zealand-born Methodist missionary-turned-politician, southern Rhodesia invested substantially in black education, housing, and healthcare. From 1953 to 1958, the Prime Minister was Garfield Todd, a liberal who did much to promote the development of the black community through investment in education, housing, and healthcare. Todd was not an egalitarian in the modern sense. He believed in a qualified, graduated pathway to political participation. But he believed in a pathway. He was eventually forced from office by white settlers who considered his reforms reckless. But the point is that within the white Rhodesian political spectrum, his brand of paternalistic liberalism had existed and had held power. Nothing analogous ever held power in South Africa after 1948. The apogee of the Rhodesian alternative vision was the 1961 Constitution, drafted under British supervision. Unlike apartheid in South Africa, which did not envisage any African rule, The 1961 Constitution provided for unimpeded progress toward African majority rule and also offered a way for Africans to qualify to vote, based on education and property ownership. There were two voter rolls, an A roll weighted toward established white voters and a B roll accessible to Africans who met lower property and education thresholds. The design was transparently intended to defer majority rule rather than permanently prevent it. But the key distinction from apartheid was that the possibility of majority rule was written into the constitutional architecture rather than constitutionally foreclosed. Rhodesia's racial exclusion was a violent problem. South Africa was a destination problem. None of this, of course, made Rhodesia a just society. The Land Apportionment Act reserved 36 million of the best of the 96 million acres for the 5% who were European. Black Rhodesians lived with structural inequality, poverty, educational deprivation, and political marginalization. It wasn't as bad as the apartheid regime in South Africa, but minority rule was bad enough. 15% of the population ruled everything. The difference between Rhodesia and South Africa was not a difference between oppression and freedom. It was a difference in the ideological self-understanding and institutional design of two white minority regimes, a difference that had real, if limited, consequences for how those systems worked and, ultimately, how they ended. The rupture came in November 1965, and it changed everything. When Ian Smith signed the Unilateral Declaration of Independence and broadcast it to the nation from Salisbury, he invoked the language of the American founding. The UDI document was deliberately modeled on the 1776 Declaration of Independence. The symbolism was pointed. This was a rebellion of free Britons against metropolitan overreach, not a racial revolution. Smith liked to say that he was not running an apartheid state. Smith announced his policies to the nation through full-page advertisements in the newspapers. No forced integration. No lowering of standards. No abdication of responsible government. No repeal of the Land Apportionment Act. No appeasement to suit the Afro-Asian bloc. The framing was conservative, not racial, standards, responsibility, and order. The word apartheid was one that Smith consistently rejected as a description of his government. And yet the logic of the post-UDI situation pulled Rhodesia steadily in directions that made that rejection harder to sustain. Isolated internationally, cut off from British legitimacy, dependent on South African economic lifelines and on Portuguese Mozambique's connivance for trade routes, Rhodesia began, reluctantly, haltingly, and with considerable self-deception, to adopt features of the system it claimed to repudiate. While domestic policy shifted to a Rhodesian version of apartheid, community development, the Rhodesian front branches also called for a military pact and the closest economic ties with South Africa. Community development was Salisbury's euphemism for what Pretoria called separate development. The names were different. The institutional logic, racially separated services, separate residential areas, and the bureaucratic sorting of people by color was converging. The Property Owners Residential Protection Act was UDI legislation. At the request of 50% of an area's property owners, a neighborhood could be racially restricted so that individuals or groups were removed from homes, schools, hospitals, or other institutions. The Municipal Amendment Act of 1967 permitted the segregation of public facilities, parks, swimming pools, and entrances to public buildings by local ordinance. These were not the past laws of the Rand or the Group Areas Act's forced removals, but they were undeniable moves toward racial codification. Critics watching from outside saw a government drifting toward the very system it publicly scorned. The ideological difference held in one crucial respect, the Endgame. Verwoerd's apartheid explicitly foreclosed black political power within a unified South Africa. The Bantustan system, the creation of nominally independent black homelands, was not a pathway to majority rule. It was a mechanism to define black South Africans as citizens of foreign statelets, forever outside the body politic of white South Africa. Rhodesia never went there. The constitutional frameworks that Smith governed under, even the 1969 Republican Constitution that entrenched white rule more deeply, retained, however cynically, the theoretical architecture of eventual majority rule. Ian Smith and other Rhodesians claimed that the political arrangement would have resulted in an evolutionary transition to black majority rule. The claim was self-serving, and the timelines were elastic to the point of bad faith. But the claim had to be made. In South Africa, it did not. Apartheid's theorists never claimed their system was transitional. This distinction produced a meaningful divergence in how the two regimes handled their final decades. South Africa's National Party government had bound itself to a system with no designed exit. When it finally began to unravel in the late 1980s, the country walked to the edge of a constitutional abyss. There was no framework, no existing mechanism, and no legal tradition pointing toward majority rule because every such tradition had been explicitly abolished. The negotiations of the early 1990s had to construct a new political architecture essentially from rubble. Rhodesia's end, though violent and bitter, followed a different script. Ian Smith, who once declared that blacks would not come to power in Rhodesia within his lifetime, sent a message to Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda conceding the chance of majority rule within 3 to 5 years and agreeing to negotiations in Lusaka.